The Walmart on the corner of 5th and Main had always been a place where people came and went, lost in their own worlds. Jake, a cashier there, had been working for years, blending into the background as customers shuffled through his line. But underneath his calm exterior, a storm was brewing. Jake was a man pushed to the edge by the monotony of his job and the rudeness of the people he encountered every day. His sanity was hanging by a thread. It was a Tuesday afternoon when the incident happened. The store was unusually busy, and Jake's line was long. He scanned items robotically, his mind drifting as he went through the motions. Then came the customer that would change everything. A man in his mid-30s with a scruffy beard and a scowl permanently etched on his face approached Jake's register. The man threw his items on the conveyor belt with a force that made Jake flinch. Without a word, Jake began scanning the items, trying to ignore the customer's hostile demeanor. As he reached for a pack of batteries, the customer snapped. "Hey, idiot! Can you go any slower?" he barked. Jake looked up, his eyes meeting the man's. He could feel his blood beginning to boil, but he remained silent, scanning the batteries and placing them in a bag. "What's the matter? Cat got your tongue?" the customer taunted, leaning in closer. Jake's grip on the scanner tightened, but he continued to ignore the man's insults. He had learned to keep his anger in check, knowing that reacting would only make things worse. But the customer wasn't finished. "You're a useless piece of trash," he said, loud enough for everyone nearby to hear. "I don't know how you even got this job." Jake's vision blurred with rage. He could feel his heart pounding in his chest, but he forced himself to remain calm. He scanned the last item and told the customer his total. The customer sneered, slamming his money on the counter. As Jake handed him his change, the customer made a move that would haunt Jake for the rest of his life. Without warning, the man punched Jake square in the jaw, knocking him to the ground. The store fell silent, and for a moment, everything seemed to move in slow motion. Jake lay on the floor, his mind racing. The pain in his jaw was nothing compared to the humiliation he felt. He could hear the other customers murmuring, but he couldn't make out their words. As he got to his feet, he saw the customer being escorted out by security, still smirking. Something inside Jake snapped. The world around him seemed to fade away, leaving only his desire for revenge. He watched as the customer disappeared from view, his mind already plotting his next move. This man would pay for what he had done. Jake would make sure of it. The days that followed were a blur. Jake continued to go to work, but his mind was consumed by thoughts of revenge. He spent his nights researching the man who had attacked him, piecing together every detail he could find. His name was Eric Thompson, and he lived just a few miles away. Jake learned his routines, his habits, and his weaknesses. As the days turned into weeks, Jake's obsession grew. He followed Eric, watching his every move. He knew when Eric left for work, where he ate lunch, and what time he returned home. Jake's anger festered, feeding off his need for vengeance. He was no longer the quiet, unassuming cashier. He had become something else entirely. One night, Jake decided it was time to act. He waited outside Eric's house, hidden in the shadows. He had planned everything meticulously, leaving nothing to chance. As the hours passed, Jake's anticipation grew. He could feel his heart racing, but he forced himself to remain calm. This had to be perfect. When Eric finally returned home, Jake was ready. He watched as Eric unlocked his front door, stepping inside. Jake moved quickly, slipping in behind him before the door closed. The house was dark, but Jake knew his way. He had studied the layout, memorizing every detail. Eric was in the kitchen, oblivious to the danger lurking behind him. Jake crept closer, his breath shallow and controlled. He could see the back of Eric's head, could hear the faint sound of him humming a tune. Jake's hand tightened around the handle of the bat he had brought, his knuckles turning white. With a swift, silent movement, Jake brought the bat down on Eric's head. The sound was sickening, a dull thud that echoed through the silent house. Eric collapsed to the floor, unconscious. Jake stood over him, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He had done it. The first part of his plan was complete, but this was only the beginning. Jake had no intention of letting Eric off easy. He dragged Eric's limp body to the basement, securing him to a chair with heavy chains. As Eric began to stir, Jake could feel a twisted sense of satisfaction. He wanted Eric to know who had brought him to this point, to understand the depth of his mistake. When Eric finally regained consciousness, he was greeted by the sight of Jake standing before him, a sinister smile on his face. Fear flashed in Eric's eyes as he struggled against the chains, but it was useless. He was trapped. "Remember me?" Jake asked, his voice cold and devoid of emotion. Eric's eyes widened in recognition, and Jake could see the panic setting in. He took a step closer, enjoying the look of terror on Eric's face. "You thought you could get away with it, didn't you?" Jake continued. "You thought you could just walk into that store, humiliate me, and go on with your life. But you were wrong." Eric tried to speak, but his words were muffled by the gag Jake had placed in his mouth. Jake watched him struggle, feeling a sense of power he had never known. This was his moment, his revenge. Over the next few days, Jake subjected Eric to a series of brutal tortures. He used everything at his disposal, from knives and hammers to psychological torment. He made sure Eric knew exactly why he was suffering, recounting every insult, every moment of humiliation. Jake was meticulous in his cruelty, ensuring that Eric felt every ounce of pain he had caused. As the days turned into weeks, Eric's spirit was broken. He no longer fought against the chains, no longer pleaded for mercy. He was a shell of the man he had once been, and Jake reveled in his victory. But as the initial thrill began to fade, Jake was left with a gnawing emptiness. His revenge had not brought him the satisfaction he had hoped for. Instead, it had left him hollow, consumed by darkness. One night, as Jake sat in the basement, watching Eric's lifeless form, he realized the depth of his mistake. He had become the very thing he despised, a monster driven by hatred and rage. He had lost himself in his quest for revenge, and now there was no turning back. With a heavy heart, Jake made a decision. He would end it all, free himself from the torment he had created. He released Eric from his chains, knowing that the man was too broken to seek help. Jake then made his way to the roof of his apartment building, the cold night air biting at his skin. As he stood on the edge, looking down at the city below, Jake felt a strange sense of peace. He had lost everything, but in this final act, he would find release. With a deep breath, he stepped off the ledge, plunging into the darkness. In the end, Jake's story was one of tragedy and madness, a cautionary tale of how easily the human mind can be consumed by anger and revenge. He had sought justice, but in the process, he had destroyed himself. And as the world continued to turn, the memory of Jake, the psycho cashier from Walmart, faded into oblivion,